Hi, I'm Barbara Joffley, CEO of Joffley Consulting, and today I'm going to show you how the transaction contract to close goes. In this video, I'm going to give you a good overview of what needs to be done from contract to close. So I'm going to explain what the buyer, lender, title company, seller does, and between all of that, what is the agent or the transaction coordinator's responsibility. So I created a flow chart to make it easier to explain and easier for you to understand and more visual so you know what comes first. Of course, please understand this is for a basic Florida transaction. Things may change places. Some things are happening both at the same time. I'm going to give you some explanation about that, but just keep in mind that the way it is not always the way it's going to be for each transaction. Some factors will make some transactions be a little bit different, but that's the basic. So with that said, I'm going to go to my computer so we can jump right in. Okay, so here we are. This is the flow chart. You see that I added buyer, seller, title company, and the lender slash bank. And that's because the agent or the title company, the agent or the transaction coordinator's responsibility is going to be working between all of these and making sure everyone is doing what they're supposed to do. So starting with the buyer, whenever we get on the contract, the buyer is going to have to send the initial deposit. So the escrow deposit, they can only send, of course, whenever the title company has their contact information. And that's where the agent and the transaction coordinator are going to be very useful here, getting all that information sent to the title company and having them send the wire instructions to the buyer. There's one big thing here. I usually don't like to get wire instructions sent to me rather than to the buyer, because that way, we're avoiding one more email address and one more way of having wire fraud. So make sure you send that information to the title company and have them send the wire instructions directly to the buyer, and have the buyer call the title company and confirm the numbers before sending the initial wire. So EMD is escrow money deposit. I know it's, in different places they call it different things. I'm used to EMD, escrow money deposit. Once that's done, or even in between, we start scheduling the inspection, which the agent or the transaction coordinator can do for the buyer. Just calling, and that just please make sure that the listing agent is aware of when the inspection is going to be done, because one, your inspector is going to need the property access information, and two, you don't want an occupied property and just the inspector showing up. I've had a few cases where the agent comes up to me and say, hey, I already scheduled the inspection. I'm like, did you tell the listing agent? Oh no. To me, that's not even considered scheduled. Okay. So until the listing agent knows when the inspector is going, it's not even scheduled. At that same time, so this is all the first week of the contract, which is, there's a lot to be done. And then while we're doing all of that, we're doing everything else, right? So that first week is the most hectic part of the contract up until the inspection period is done. So send the escrow deposit, schedule the inspection, and send the initial documents to the lender, which if you go down the lender part, you're going to see here that the loan application is right here. So the buyer is going to send those documents so the lender can submit the file to initial application, and there's an application to be signed. So the buyer needs to do that, as quickly as possible. But of course, we know the lender is going to be reaching out to them. All we need to do as realtors and transactional coordinators is make sure that communication is existent. So when I send that initial email to the title company with the buyer information, I copy the lender on it. That way, they're talking, and I'm sure that the lender is aware that there's a contract, and the lender reaches out to the buyer. Of course, they already have the buyer's information because, they had a pre-approval, or, so they've been talking even before the contract, but just make sure that they know it's on the contract and they're talking to the buyer and getting that set of documents ready to submit for initial approval. Okay. Right after this is usually when the inspection report is back. It's usually done one day after the inspection. Some inspectors will get it done the same day. And what I call the ICR is the inspection contingency release. So To me, what I like to do as a transaction coordinator is make sure there's an actual release of that deadline and that everybody's aware of what was done to meet that deadline, the inspection deadline, inspection slash cancellation. So it's either an addendum signed by all parties, which, price change or a credit or repairs, have that document executed, or let the listing agent know in writing that the buyer is moving forward with without requesting anything, if that's the case. If it's a cancellation, then I don't even have to move forward. So, cancellation is cancellation. There's nothing else I need to tell you about, right? So once that's done, or even before, I put shop for insurance here because there's so many things going on before the inspection that if the inspection period is really quick, I usually start talking about insurance after the inspection. Some inspection periods, let's say there's a tenant or it's a vacation home and the inspection period is going to last like 10 days because it's occupied. So I usually already start talking about insurance even before the inspection period. But if that's not the case for you, then, you can talk to them after the inspection. Let's say it lasted 5 days, then as a transaction coordinator, I try and get quotes for the buyer. So I work with a few companies that I can get quotes. Of course, I don't explain anything about insurance. All I do is just get the quotes. If they have any questions, I put them in contact with the insurance company so that they can explain what each quote is, what's covered and what's not, what they can add, what they cannot, and all of that. And also the insurance company will need to know what kind of loan it is, what kind of property, why they're buying, and all those things that you can send ahead of time to the insurance company so that they can give the best quote possible for your buyer. Okay, so next on the buyer side, they're going to have to pay for the appraisal. And that is very common for buyers to think that everything's going to be paid at closing. The appraisal report and of course the inspection report, but both of these reports are usually not paid at closing. Some lenders will allow it in some specific cases, but don't count on it. So they have to know that they have to pay for the appraisal report ahead of time. Usually the lenders will let them know, but as an agent, you can remind them because it's a lot of information, so it's hard to remember. So they have to pay for the appraisal. Only after they pay will the appraisal company reach out to the listing agent to schedule. After the appraisal's done, and here I didn't even add anything before pay the appraisal and submit the loan condition docs, because I'm going to explain a little bit more about this. Sometimes there's one thing in between here, which is discussing the appraisal price, right? And that's something that a transaction coordinator cannot do. This is between the agent, the buyer, and the listing agent, and their seller. So if the appraised value comes lower, the buyer can accept the price as it is and pay the difference. The seller can lower the purchase price. Or the contract can be canceled. But this is between the agents. Okay, the transaction coordinator cannot get involved. If there are any documents that need to be shared with all parties, that's what the transaction coordinator will do. So she will make sure that the lender has like a change of price, or that the lender is aware that everyone is okay with the lower price and the buyer's going to pay the difference. Just, informing everybody of what's going on, but not necessarily discussing anything with anyone or giving any instructions on how to move forward. So here we're going straight to submit the loan condition docs. And of course, by this time, and I'll show you on the lender part, there was already a conditional approval of the file. One thing that I always like to do as a transaction coordinator is make sure that these documents are submitted and approved before the loan commitment deadline, because it's just a better way to protect the buyer. I can't really get into details. I'm not an attorney, but I do prefer to have a clear to close, to have those documents submitted to the lender and have the file clear to close and 100% approved before the loan commitment deadline. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And then if it doesn't, I'll see if there is if it's needed to extend the loan condition period, but I just don't like to not have the clear to close before that deadline. So here, just wanted to give you an overview of what's happened so far. So far, we only talked about the buyer. We're going to start talking about the seller and then the title company and then the lender. But everything is pretty much happening at the same time. And the order is pretty much that exact one that I just gave you with the buyer. Now we're going to talk about the seller. What are the responsibilities of the seller and what the agent and or transaction coordinator should do here to help each seller. So first thing, this is considering the seller has a loan, right? If they don't have a loan, then just skip this part. But if the seller has a loan on the property, they have to send the loan information to the title company. Not only do they need to send the lender's name, the file number, many title companies, of course, many lenders, because that's why the title companies will ask for it, for a signed document authorizing the title company to reach out to the bank and get a payoff letter. So I always try to make sure that the seller signs it by hand, wet signs it, rather than an e-signature, because some banks will authorize this document with the e-signature, some won't. So you never know. You don't want to waste that time sending that e-signed document, and then the lender, the bank is going to request a wet signed document. So I ask all the sellers to just wet sign it and email it back to me. That way, we make sure everything is right. Like I said, the seller part doesn't have a lot to do as much as the buyer does. So right after this, usually we're just going to jump right into the inspection, repair, or credit request that the buyer will send. So that's another thing that a transaction coordinator cannot do. We cannot discuss repair or credit in any point of the contract. Okay, so anything that needs to be a decision between buyer and seller, a transaction coordinator cannot weigh in. All we can do is work on the paperwork that comes out of it. So if there is any credit, any repairs, we can just get that document sent to all parties. Okay, another thing here is usually if there is an addendum out of this discussion period, if there is an addendum, then it has to come signed by the buyer, and then the transaction coordinator will have that document signed by the seller and then share back with the selling agent, right? So it's ideal that when you're working with the buyer, just have that document signed ahead of time by the buyer. It might seem, just obvious to you, but I promise you, I've received a lot of credit and repair requests without the buyer's signature. So keep that in mind. So when clearing the lien search conditions, that is only if there are, of course, any conditions on the lien search. And I said conditions, but it's more of like problems, issues. I don't like that word very much, but it is what it is. So if there is any open permits, if there are, if he owes a roof to someone, so there's a lien on the property, so those things, a transaction coordinator can help the seller clear those things out. So if there's an open permit, we can call the building department and ask them what needs to be done. Sometimes it's something so simple, just a phone call, be like, "Ooh, we forgot that needed to be done. It's here on the desk. It's just not uploaded to the system." And then, they close it out. I've had cases like that. I've had cases where a property was built in 2013 and I had to call the builder because they never closed the permit for the pool enclosure. So, and they're like from back in 2013 and they're having to go back to the property and, get that ready. There were repairs to be done and they did the repairs with no cost to the seller, which that was great. And then they called the city and had them go there and respect. So this is a very important part on the seller side. And if you have a transaction coordinator and if you are a transaction coordinator, this can really help a seller a whole lot. This is the same as on the buyer side, right? When we were talking about discussing the appraised value, and that is way out here, between the pay for the appraisal. I wanted to put that somewhere, so I put it on the seller side just so we could talk about it, but that's exactly what I just said on the buyer side. If the appraisal comes lower and all that stuff, this is what this is right now, which usually happens around here. And then after we're done with the appraisal side, The seller has to start getting ready to move out and do all that stuff. And of course, they'll deliver. I said deliver the keys at the title office, but that is just one of the options. So after the appraisal part, that's when the seller is going to start getting ready, because chances are this loan is going to be approved. So the seller has to start getting ready to move out and leave the property. I said here deliver keys at the title office, but that's just one of the options, okay? The seller can leave all the keys inside the property and leave a lockbox outside for the buyer, or, they can meet with the buyer. Some sellers like to meet with the buyer for the final walkthrough and just walk through the house. And if it's their decision to give the key right there, it's not very common and not very usual, but if the seller wants to do that, then fine. It's the seller's decision, but it happens a lot that the seller would just drop off the keys at the title's office, because sometimes they sign a day or two before the buyer. So just drop it off and get that over with. Okay, so going back to the big picture, we went through the buyer side, we went through the seller side. I didn't even talk about the closing date yet, because that's the last thing I'm going to talk about. There are a few things to talk about this specific day. We're going to jump right into the title company, and they have a lot of work to do. And as transaction coordinators and as agent, we have a lot of things to check here. So the first thing the title company is going to do is send the wire instructions to the buyer, because usually the buyer only has 3 days to get the EMD, escrow money deposit, done. So that's the first thing. Then they're going to start working on their searches and sending the title docs to the lender. So, whatever documents that the lender needs, and, the lender will send a list of what they need to the title company, and they'll just share it. I've seen cases where the lender will reach out to me like 2 weeks after the contract being signed, saying, hey, I don't have the title docs yet. Or even after the initial approval, I still don't have the title docs. So we want to make sure we're on top of the title company and making sure that this is sent. I'm not saying anything bad about the title company, but sometimes they're busy. Sometimes they have a lot to do. And, as agent and transaction coordinators, we need to make sure that that's sent as soon as possible. So the title company is going to order here the lien search and the title search. The lien search is what I talked about with the seller. There's even an error here connecting, because if there are any issues that the title company found on the lien search, or if there are any clouds on the title, which is something that you should look into and see exactly what it is and what are the clouds on the title. But if there is one, the title company will reach out to the seller, and the seller is going to have to do whatever it is. There are many ways that it can be a cloud on the title. So the title company will let the seller know what needs to be done to clear that out. Not very common, doesn't happen very often, at least with me. My past over 600 transactions, I can't remember of like 2 or 3 that we had a cloud in the title, and it was very easy to clear. Lien search, on the other hand, there's usually something. There is an open, water bill, or there's an open lien or open permit, which is what we just talked about when we were talking about the seller, right? So the title company will order these searches. After the title search is back, they'll have the preliminary title commitment. And they have to share that with everybody. It is the seller's responsibility that the title commitment itself is shared with everyone. So make sure when you're working with the seller that the title company is sending this to the selling agent. Sometimes they'll send it to the listing agent only, and I always email them just to have in writing, did you email the selling agent? Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. Make sure it's sent, okay? That is very important. And then they'll order the seller payoff, which they may order here. They may order a little bit ahead of time. That'll depend on how long this contract is going to be. If it's a 30-day contract, because there's also a deadline. It's only good for a certain amount of time. So if it's a 45-day contract and it's only good for 30 days, they're not going to order it in the beginning of the contract. They're going to order it like 2 to 3 weeks before closing, just to make sure it's valid at closing. Okay, so they have to order that. The estoppel, of course, is only if there is an HOA association. So that's a document that will show if the seller owes anything to the HOA, if there are any open violations or anything like that. If there are any open violations, that's where the agent and the transaction coordinator are very helpful here, reaching out to the HOA, making sure, because usually on the estoppel, it's very vague what the problem is. Sometimes the seller knows what it is, sometimes they don't, especially if you're working with a foreign national client. They will probably not even know that there is an open violation. And HOAs are very vague with that information, and just, make sure you call them and know exactly what they want, because it may seem like one thing, but call them and say, hey, exactly what it is that you want me to do here. And then talking to the seller, maybe you have to cut the grass, maybe you have to trim a tree, things like that the transaction coordinator can just arrange for the seller. Once all the searches are done, once everything else has been taken care of, all the issues, everything has been closed out, that's usually when also the lender is ready to go and the file's clear to close, which is right here. I'm going to talk about it. And then the title company is also going to be ready, hopefully, and they're going to start balancing the closing numbers. So I'm going to jump into the lender part so that I can explain to you when they're ready, and it's usually at the same time or even a little bit later. The title company is usually ready earlier, but usually at the same time they'll start balancing the numbers. So on the lender part, it's of course very connected to the buyer, right? So they depend on the buyer to send documents, to send information. So it's very connected to the buyer. So first of all, they'll submit the loan application to the underwriter for approval. But in order to do that, the buyer has to have sent the initial docs and signed the actual application. So that's just simple, receiving documents, sending it to underwriter. Once that's done, they're going to start requesting services, which is the appraisal, title documents, insurance. Some agents, in some cases, they'll ask for the appraisal to only be ordered after the inspection period. And that is if, let's say, they know that the property is really bad looking, they're not sure the buyer is going to keep it, they're not sure the seller is going to fix anything, because the buyer has to pay for the appraisal ahead of time and it's not cheap. Some agents will ask the lender if there's a possibility that they can order the appraisal only after the inspection period, just to avoid the buyer paying a price ahead of time and losing that money, So that is one thing that some agents do, but this needs to be notified to the lender. If that's the case, if that's what the agent wants to do, they have to notify the lender. Okay. While all of this is happening, the underwriter is reviewing all the documents that were sent with the application, and they'll release the conditional approval, hopefully, right? That's what we're thinking. So they'll have the conditional approval, and of course, as a conditional approval, there will be some conditions to be cleared from the title company, the lender, from the buyer, and that's when we talked about way up here submitting loan condition docs. That's after the approval is done. Then the buyer is going to have like another set of documents to send. And one of them, which, not necessarily 100% depends on the buyer, but, if they don't pay, it depends on them, is the appraisal inspection, right? That's usually going to be one of the conditions. And once that's cleared out, and that's why we need to notify the seller, because, if there is any price change, if there is anything, the lender needs to receive the appraisal report, and they need to receive anything that was done to meet the appraisal conditions or the appraisal requirements. So either lower the purchase price, or the buyer's going to pay the difference, whatever it is, that needs to be sent to the lender. Once all that appraisal and all those documents that the buyer sent are received by the lender, they're going to send the file back to the underwriter to have the loan conditions cleared. So the underwriter is going to review everything. I asked for 5 documents. I'm going to review all those 5 documents. Is everything okay? If it is, then we have clear to close. If it isn't, then they'll send another list of conditions, and we're going to go like that until we close. Believe me, I've had cases that went back and forth with the underwriter 5 to 6 times because Lord knows what the buyer was doing. Anyway, it happens. So the clear to close, I usually send, some transactions are so hard. I'll send a sticker with someone doing a little party thing because we're clear to close. I'm like, finally, man, finally clear to close. This is one of the happiest day, the actual happiest day is the closing, but one of the happiest days, the clear to close, because it means, it's done. It's clear to close. All you need to do is sign the documents. That's what you think. Just kidding. Hopefully, all you need to do is sign the documents. And that's when the lender is going to balance the numbers with the title company. Not the lender, but, the group. They're going to balance the numbers with the title company and make sure everything is correct. And once those numbers are balanced, we're going to get to the closing date. So here we are, the closing date. This is basically the date that buyers and sellers are going to sign the documents and have everything released. There are a few ways that the buyer and seller can sign. The seller can sign ahead of time. As long as the title company is ready to close, they can sign ahead of time. They don't have to close on the contract closing date. They can close a little bit ahead of time. And there are different ways of signing the documents. So there are different ways of closing. The buyer can sign at the title office, or the seller at the title office with the notary, there. They can sign as a remote online notary, which is called a RON. And that is my favorite way by far, because it's like a Zoom call with, not Zoom, but, their own app. And the buyer or seller will sign everything online, and it's going to be notarized online and sent to the title company. And it's easy. It's the best way possible, but it's not always allowed. So always make sure you check with the title company and with the lender if both their underwriters approve that, which, if that's a possibility, is the best way. It can be signed as a mail away, to where the documents are going to be emailed to the buyer or seller. They're going to print, sign, have them notarized, and that is one thing. If it's a foreign national buyer or seller, you have to make sure you check with the title company and the lender if they're authorized to sign with just a regular notary at their country, or if they have to go to the U.S. Embassy and have the documents signed. So you would want to check that way ahead of time, because if it's a mail away, you want to make sure that the buyer knows they have to schedule an appointment with the U.S. Embassy if that's the case. Sometimes it's hard to get that appointment. And with the mail away, once everything is signed, they're going to mail the documents back. So the closing can happen, but the funding will only happen after the original documents arrive at the title company. So that's usually done for foreign nationals. When is someone in the United States, but they cannot go to the title office because they're in a different state, or they're just too far away, or they have to work? The best option is a mobile notary, of course, if the RON is not allowed. But the second best option is a mobile notary, where the buyer or seller is going to have to pay for a notary appointed by the title company to meet with them at the address, date, and time that they scheduled. And that notary is going to have them sign, notarize the documents, and mail the originals back. Same way, the funding is only going to happen after those documents arrive at the title company. But the difference is you don't have to go to a U.S. consulate. And, because a mobile notary is not going to go to a different country, then that's why we do mobile notary within the U.S. And outside of the U.S., it's what we call a mail away. So that's the biggest difference, because in the end, they're both documents that are mailed back to the title company. On this date is usually when the keys are also going to be released to the buyer. Hopefully closing and funding are at the same day. If it's a mail away, keys are usually released after funding if it's not the same day. So the buyer's going to get their keys. They're going to be able to move in. If there's a tenant, then that's something else. They're not going to get the keys. They're not going to be able to move in. But we'll talk about it in a different video. There's a lot to talk about, a lot of things to think about when buying a property with a tenant, on the transaction part of it. So a lot goes on the closing date for that. But that's it. This is how it is. So this is how it is, contract to close. To me, it's a very streamlined and easy and simple process. If you have any questions, if anything didn't get very clear, write a comment and I'll make sure I'll answer to you, or we can talk. I'm available to talk to anyone if you want to talk about it, because I love it. Make sure you leave a comment for anything that you want. Give me a like and subscribe to my channel, because there's a lot more information coming up.